At a Buckingham Palace dinner dance in the summer of 1920, a 19-year-old debutante from Scotland was introduced to the man who would soon be the most photographed person on Earth. The debutante was Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, ninth child of the 14th Earl of Strathmore. The man was Edward, Prince of Wales, heir to the British and Imperial thrones. They danced once. They danced twice. They danced a third time. The dance card she kept in her dressing table drawer for the next 82 years recorded, beside Edward's name, 3 small initials in blue ink, written by Lady Elizabeth herself. A.G.A. The Royal Archivist who found the card in 1979 looked up what the initials stood for. They were a Bowes-Lyon family shorthand. They meant, above going after. 3 years later, in January 1923, Elizabeth accepted a marriage proposal from Edward's younger brother, Albert. It was her third such proposal from him. The first 2 she had refused. The man she had marked above going after had by then become permanently attached to a woman named Mrs Freda Dudley Ward. That story, the precise date, the sequence of 3 dances, the dance card, the 3 initials, the 1979 archivist discovery, the interpretation offered by a single unnamed Bowes-Lyon cousin in 1981, doesn't appear in William Shawcross's official biography, published by Macmillan in 2009, with complete access to Elizabeth's personal papers and the Royal Archives. It doesn't appear in Hugo Vickers' independent biography of 2005, based on private recollections and extensive archival research. Whether the card exists precisely as described, and whether the initials mean what the family tradition claims, the documentary record can't confirm. What it can confirm is the sequence of events the story illustrates. Wallis Simpson, the woman who eventually and definitively secured Edward, died in Paris on the 24th of April, 1986. Her funeral was held at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, days later. Queen Elizabeth II attended. Prince Philip attended. Prince Charles attended. The Queen Mother, then 85 and in reasonable health, was reported indisposed by her press secretary. She was photographed that same afternoon at Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park, approximately 2 miles from the chapel, being driven in her car in apparently normal health. That's not constitutional grievance, 50 years on. That's something considerably more personal. The documented timeline, carefully read, suggests what the official account has never been willing to say directly. Elizabeth Angela Marguerite Bowes-Lyon was born on the 4th of August, 1900, the 9th of 10 children of Claude Bowes-Lyon, who became the 14th Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn in 1904. The family's principal seat was Glamis Castle in Angus, Scotland, in Bowes-Lyon family connection since 1372, when Robert II of Scotland granted the thaneage of Glamis to Sir John Lyon as a reward for service. St. Paul's Walden Bury in Hertfordshire served as the English home. The 14th Earl wasn't especially wealthy by the standards of the great Edwardian fortunes, land-rich and cash-constrained, as many Scottish landed families were by 1920. But the name was old, the connections were impeccable, and the family had been moving in royal circles for generations, without quite being royal. Elizabeth was educated at home by a governess, passed the Oxford local examination with distinction at 13, and by adolescence had developed the quality that almost every subsequent observer noted, and almost none adequately described. She made everyone she spoke to feel as though they were the specific person she had most wanted to see. It was social intelligence of a high order, deployed from early childhood with a consistency that, examined carefully across the historical record, begins to look less like natural warmth and more like skilled management of impression. 3 portraits survive from people who knew her closely. Stephen Tennant, the acutest social observer of the era, She looked everything that she wasn't: gentle, gullible, tenderness mingled with dispassionate serenity, cool, well-bred, remote. Behind this veil, she schemed and vacillated, hard as nails. Cecil Beaton, who photographed her across decades, a marshmallow made on a welding machine. Harold Nicholson, who observed her at court functions for 30 years, the greatest queen since Cleopatra. 3 portraits of the same woman, none of them wrong, and the tension between them more revealing than any single one alone. During the First World War, Glamis was converted into a convalescent hospital for wounded officers. Elizabeth, who was 14 when the war began in August 1914, was too young to formally nurse, but helped with general care, meals, and the management of a household that had become, for more than 200 men across 4 years, the first environment resembling home they'd encountered since France. Her brother Fergus was killed at the Battle of Loos in September 1915. Her brother Michael was reported missing in April 1917 and eventually found to have been captured and held as a prisoner of war. One of the officers who passed through Glamis wrote in Elizabeth's autograph book that she was destined to be hung in diamonds, drawn in a coach and 4, and quartered in the best house in the land. He wasn't wrong. Her warmth with ordinary people, genuinely felt, but also practiced across 4 years of specific daily contact, became the foundation of a public persona that lasted a century. By the spring of 1919, the London season was resuming after the 4-year interruption of the war. The social calculus had frayed at the edges, but hadn't collapsed. Daughters of earls were expected to marry within the peerage. George V and Queen Mary, both acutely aware of the political value of their sons marrying British-born aristocratic wives rather than European princesses, were paying close attention to exactly the class of women Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon represented. In 1920, their eldest son Edward would turn 26. Their second son, Albert, had just been created Duke of York in June of that year. The question of which son was entering the season as an eligible prospect was, from inside the court, a question with a complicated answer. Edward, Prince of Wales, was by the summer of 1920 the closest thing the English-speaking world had to what a later era would call a global celebrity. His post-war imperial tours had been extraordinary exercises in public relations. His 1919 Canadian visit drew crowds of tens of thousands in every city from Halifax to Vancouver. Academic literature on celebrity culture in the 1920s identifies him consistently as the defining figure of the decade. Philip Ziegler, his authorized biographer, wrote that Edward was the 20th century's Prince Charming. Handsome, eloquent, quick-witted, charismatic, a dazzling foil to his stuffy royal parents. He dressed well, danced well, and appeared in every photograph and press report to be single, glamorous, and eventually marriageable. In the circles immediately surrounding the palace, the situation was considerably different. In February 1918, at a dance in Belgrave Square at the house of Mrs. Kerr Smiley, the sister, as it happens, of a shipping merchant named Ernest Simpson, Edward had met Winifred Dudley Ward. Freda, to everyone who knew the situation. She was 23, married to William Dudley Ward, a Liberal MP with 2 daughters. From February 1918 onward, Freda was the central fact of Edward's private life. Ziegler's biography, drawing on Edward's own papers, describes the attachment as indispensable throughout the early 1920s. Edward wrote to Freda constantly, addressed her as "my angel," and telephoned her, by some accounts, 4 or 5 times a night when they were apart. The published correspondence between them covers 1918 to 1921 and runs to 400 pages. George V and Queen Mary were already, by 1920, expressing mounting frustration with Edward's failure to settle and his emotional dependence on another man's wife. Within the aristocratic social world and the royal household, this was common knowledge by 1919 at the latest. The British press didn't report it. Press discretion in 1920 bore no resemblance to what came later, so to the wider public, Edward appeared unattached. But in the drawing rooms Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was entering in the summer of 1920, anyone paying attention knew the situation. Elizabeth paid attention to everything. Whether she knew about Freda Dudley Ward when she first danced with Edward that summer isn't directly stated in any document publicly released. What the record establishes is that the man reportedly marked above going after was, at the precise moment of any such marking, already privately devoted to another woman and had been for 2 years. For a 19-year-old of acute social intelligence entering a world where this information was available, the calculation wasn't necessarily simple. Albert, Bertie to his family, created Duke of York in June 1920, was the second son and in every visible respect a different proposition from his brother. He'd served in the Royal Navy during the war, present at the Battle of Jutland in May 1916. He had genuine courage, genuine shyness, and a severe stammer that made public life an ordeal. He'd fixed, completely, on Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon. He asked his equerry, James Stuart, an old Scottish acquaintance of Elizabeth's, who was also courting her himself, to introduce them formally. Stuart eventually accepted a better-paid position in the American oil industry and left Albert's service. Albert's certainty didn't waver. In the spring of 1921, the precise location given variously as St. Paul's Waldenbury in Hertfordshire or Glamis in Scotland, depending on the source, Albert proposed to Elizabeth for the first time. She refused. He wrote to his mother, Queen Mary. The letters exist in the Royal Archives within Queen Mary's papers. Shawcross drew on them directly for his official biography. What he summarized from them: Elizabeth's stated reason was her reluctance to take on the constraints of royal life. Vickers attributes to her the sentiment that she was afraid never again to be free to think, speak, and act as she felt she really ought to. Queen Mary visited Glamis to assess the young woman her son was determined to have. She concluded Elizabeth was the one girl who could make Bertie happy, and declined to interfere. The refusal stood. The Royal Archives holds correspondence from this period, letters between Elizabeth and her parents, family correspondence touching on this window of time, and Shawcross drew on it extensively. What that archive doesn't yield, at least in any version that has reached the public record, is correspondence between Elizabeth and Edward himself during these years, suggesting any sustained personal connection beyond ordinary court acquaintance. The absence isn't itself conclusive. Correspondence of that nature, if it existed, would be precisely the kind of material most likely to remain restricted or inaccessible. But the script would be dishonest to present it as documented when it isn't. What is documented? At this precise moment in the spring of 1921, the Freda Dudley Ward attachment was 3 years old, in full intensity, and an established fact in the relevant social world. There was no sign of it cooling. Ziegler's biography describes it as unchanged and uncontested, regarded by those who knew Edward as simply the permanent architecture of his private life. Nobody close to the situation believed the arrangement was temporary. Albert came to Glamis that September to shoot partridges. The visit is recorded. He continued his courtship during that stay and reportedly pressed his suit again. The sources conflict on whether this constituted a formal second proposal or simply renewed pursuit, but the pattern of contact across the autumn of 1921 is documented. Elizabeth declined, again, to commit. She was 21 years old. The season was full of occasions. She was present at them. The question the official account doesn't quite get around to answering is what, specifically, Elizabeth was waiting for. The refusal framing, a young woman reluctant to accept the gilded cage, valuing her freedom above position, requires us to believe that what she was doing across 1921 was primarily avoiding something. The documented record of her social movements suggests, rather, a young woman who remained conspicuously active in exactly the circles where the heir to the throne was to be found. She wasn't withdrawing from royal adjacency. She was declining one specific commitment while remaining available for the broader social field. By the end of 1921, Edward's situation hadn't changed. Freda Dudley Ward was precisely where she'd been in February 1918. The prince showed no sign of moving toward anything resembling a conventional marital arrangement. For anyone paying careful attention, and Elizabeth paid careful attention to everything, that was information. In February 1922, Elizabeth served as a bridesmaid at Westminster Abbey for the wedding of Princess Mary, Albert's sister, to Henry Lascelles, Viscount Lascelles. Participating enthusiastically in a royal family wedding while declining, for the second or third time, to join that family permanently is one of those small inconsistencies the official account smooths over without quite addressing. Elizabeth wasn't avoiding royal occasions. She was declining one specific commitment. Albert proposed again the following month, March 1922. She refused again. He was said to be distressed. She wasn't, by any documented account, distressed, at least not in any form she allowed to surface. Later that same year, something worth noting circulated in the social world Elizabeth was inhabiting, a false report that she was to be engaged to Albert's elder brother, the Prince of Wales. The report had no basis in fact, and Elizabeth was reportedly annoyed at it. But the fact that such a rumor circulated at all, that it was sufficiently plausible to travel as gossip among people who knew the relevant parties, says something about the social logic of the moment, even if it says nothing about the facts. Edward returned from a major imperial tour in June 1922, hailed across the Commonwealth as its most popular public figure. He continued writing to and visiting Freda Dudley Ward throughout that year. The arrangement showed no signs of resolution. At some point between 1918 and early 1923, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon made a calculation. On the 2nd of January 1923, Albert took Elizabeth to dinner at Claridge's Hotel in London and afterwards to the theatre. He proposed for what all sources agree was the final time before acceptance. She asked for time. She took 10 days. On Sunday the 14th of January 1923, Elizabeth accepted. The engagement was announced in the court circular on the 15th. George V recorded it in his diary on the same day. Albert had informed him of his engagement to Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon. The palace's formal statement carried the king's pleasure in terms that read, as these statements always do, as though the outcome had been inevitable from the beginning. It's with the greatest pleasure that the king and queen announce the betrothal of their beloved son, the Duke of York, to the Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, daughter of the Earl and Countess of Strathmore and Kinghorn. The Times, in its contemporaneous report, described Albert as, to most people, whether they know him or not, just a young Englishman, devoted to duty, and Elizabeth as a friend of his sister's and much loved by all who know her. The template the public biography would follow for 80 years was established within days of the announcement. Elizabeth wrote to Albert in the days immediately following, "I do love you, Bertie, and feel certain that I shall more and more. I shall miss you terribly." The affection in that letter reads as genuine, and nobody who examines what followed doubts it became so. George VI's dependence on Elizabeth's emotional steadiness was absolute across 29 years of marriage, and she delivered it without visible hesitation. Their partnership, whatever its origins, wasn't a performance. The timing argument requires precision about its own limits. The Freda Dudley Ward relationship, in January 1923, had been in continuous existence for 5 years. There wasn't a single dramatic moment in late 1922 or early 1923 at which Edward's unavailability became newly apparent. The relationship had been an open secret in those circles since 1919. What changed was Elizabeth's calculation of what remained possible. Her willingness, at 22, to accept that 5 years of unchanging fact constituted a permanent answer about one man, and to give a different answer about another. The inference is supported by the documented sequence. It isn't proved by it. Shawcross's account, with complete access to everything Elizabeth ever wrote, doesn't raise the inference at all. Not to explore it, not to dismiss it. The parallel timeline, Albert proposing across 2 years while the Prince of Wales remained privately devoted to a married woman across all those proposals, is simply absent from the official record. Whether that's editorial judgment or something more deliberately protective, the authorized biographer hasn't said. The engagement ring Albert gave Elizabeth was platinum, set with a dark oval cashmere sapphire surrounded by diamonds. They married at Westminster Abbey on the 26th of April, 1923. Elizabeth laid her bridal bouquet at the tomb of the unknown warrior as she entered the abbey, in memory of her brother Fergus. They moved into 145 Piccadilly in Mayfair. From 1923 to 1936, 13 years as Duchess of York, Elizabeth built the public persona that would eventually make her the most beloved member of the royal family across 5 subsequent decades. She accompanied Albert on the East Africa tour from December 1924 to April 1925. She worked alongside him through the speech therapy developed by Lionel Logue from October 1925 onward, the sessions that would eventually allow George VI to broadcast to the nation with the steady authority the wartime years required. The 1927 tour to Australia, during which they opened Parliament House in Canberra, was a public relations success attributed largely to her. Princess Elizabeth was born in April 1926. Princess Margaret arrived at Glamis in August 1930. The family at 145 Piccadilly became, in the press and in public perception, the model of domestic normalcy the monarchy needed after the social disruptions of the 1920s. All of this was the visible record. The less visible record was what Elizabeth was watching from her position in the second tier of the royal family, as the heir to the throne continued to make his choices. Freda Dudley Ward was eased out around 1929 in the manner these transitions were managed in that world. She telephoned St. James's Palace one day and was told, calmly, that there were orders not to put her through. A decade of "My Angel," 400 published letters, ended with a telephone operator reading from an instruction list. Thelma, Viscountess Furness, an American, twice married, became the primary attachment from approximately 1929 onward. Thelma introduced Edward to a friend of hers sometime around 1931, a Baltimore-born American woman in her second marriage named Wallis Simpson. By 1934, it was Wallis. The transition from Thelma to Wallis followed the same pattern as the transition from Freda to Thelma: clean, abrupt, and conducted without evident sentiment for the woman being replaced. Photograph after photograph from the 1920s and 1930s places the Duke and Duchess of York at court functions, empire exhibitions, official ceremonies. The photographic record shows the 3 siblings, Edward, Albert, Elizabeth, in the same spaces repeatedly across those years: garden parties, family gatherings at Sandringham and Balmoral. The woman Edward brought to those occasions across the decade changed. The Duchess of York was a constant presence. Across that period, what Edward was doing with his private life followed a consistent pattern. Freda Dudley Ward, British, married, institutionally unavailable for any legitimate public relationship. Thelma Furness, American, twice married. Wallis Simpson, American, working toward her second divorce. Each woman Edward chose over those 13 years was, in one respect or another, the opposite of what Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon had represented in the summer of 1920. Available, English, aristocratic, and marriageable in the straightforward sense the institution required. The man who had been, in that summer, the most glamorous, nominally eligible figure in the English-speaking world, had spent over a decade demonstrating, with increasing specificity, what he actually wanted. None of it, at any point, pointed toward Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon. George V died on the 20th of January, 1936. Edward became King Edward VIII. Albert became heir presumptive. The constitutional crisis that followed unfolded across 11 months and resolved itself, as those who understood Edward's temperament might have anticipated, in favor of the woman rather than the throne. The constitutional mechanics of the abdication don't require rehearsing in detail. The audience knows them. Stanley Baldwin refused to countenance the marriage. The Archbishop of Canterbury produced his objections. Edward was offered the choice and made it. He signed the instrument of abdication on the 10th of December, 1936, and formally abdicated on the 11th. Albert became King George VI. Elizabeth became Queen Consort. Their coronation was held at Westminster Abbey on the 12th of May, 1937, the date previously scheduled for Edward's coronation. Elizabeth's documented response to what was approaching was written on the 17th of November, 1936, in a letter to Queen Mary. "I feel quite overcome with horror and emotion." The letter survives. The horror it describes was genuine. The prospect of her anxious, stammering husband bearing the full weight of the monarchy was a real terror, and her support for him across 16 subsequent years of kingship was equally real. The therapy sessions, the wartime broadcasts, the particular social scaffolding she constructed around a man who found public life an ordeal. When Buckingham Palace was bombed during the Blitz in September 1940, her statement, "I'm glad we've been bombed. It makes me feel I can look the East End in the face," became one of the defining utterances of the war. Adolf Hitler called her the most dangerous woman in Europe. These facts are documented, real, and credited to her without qualification. Also documented, a letter written by Elizabeth in August 1940 to Walter Monckton, who'd been Edward's legal advisor during the abdication proceedings, is catalogued in the Monckton Papers. A published account describes a passage in that letter in which Elizabeth refers to Wallis Simpson as the lowest of the low. The actual text of that passage has been physically removed from the catalogued version of the document. The letter exists as an archival item. Its excised portion isn't accessible to researchers. The redaction is itself a documentable fact, and it tells its own story about what someone thought worth removing. On the 3rd of June, 1937, Edward married Wallis at the Château de Condé in France. No member of the royal family attended. George VI, with Elizabeth's documented support, withheld the designation Her Royal Highness from Wallis. She'd be Her Grace, the Duchess of Windsor, not an HRH. Edward retained his Royal Highness. That distinction was encoded into every place card, every formal introduction, every piece of official correspondence for the remainder of their lives together, maintained, without exception, for 35 years. The form the subsequent decades took was, for the most part, studied absence. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor spent those years largely in France and weren't invited to court functions. Wallis wasn't received. The social quarantine required active maintenance across 3 decades and was conducted with complete consistency. Both the Duke and Duchess of Windsor referred to the Queen Mother in private as Cookie. The derivation, in the accounts that preserved it, appears to have been a supposed resemblance to a fat Scottish cook. The Queen Mother was, by all accounts, aware of it. Her response was silence, at least in any form the public record preserved. Hugo Vickers, who spent years interviewing people who'd known Elizabeth across her entire life, offered the sharpest encapsulation of how she operated. "I would love to know when she learned she had more to gain by saying nothing than by saying something in particular." That's not a description of equanimity. That's a description of strategic restraint applied to a sustained private position. Michael Thornton, whose 1985 book Royal Feud, The Queen Mother and the Duchess of Windsor, is the most exhaustively documented account of the relationship between the two women, was in the unusual position of having been a confidant to both. What each woman told him about the other, Thornton noted, would make anybody blush. His account documents a dynamic across 3 decades that the official record consistently frames as constitutional disagreement, and that, in Thornton's description, reads rather more like personal warfare conducted with exceptional surface control by both parties. The Duke of Grafton, who had known the Queen Mother well, recalled that she never said anything nasty about the Duchess of Windsor, except to say she really hadn't got a clue what she was dealing with. That's a courtier's version of something pointed. It's also the kind of comment that survives precisely because it sounds mild enough to repeat. Edward, Duke of Windsor, died in Paris on the 28th of May, 1972. Wallis came to Windsor Castle for the reception before the funeral. She and the Queen Mother were in the same room. No documented account of that encounter suggests warmth. The Queen Mother continued to use Royal Lodge as her Windsor residence. Wallis returned to Paris and to the progressive deterioration, physical and then cognitive, that would occupy her final 14 years. Wallis, Duchess of Windsor, died at her home in the Bois de Boulogne on the 24th of April, 1986, at the age of 89. Her funeral was held at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, in the final days of that month. The Queen attended. Prince Philip attended. Prince Charles attended. The Queen Mother, then 85, was reported indisposed. She was photographed that same afternoon at Royal Lodge, 2 miles from the chapel, in apparently normal health, being driven in her car. The press secretary who issued the indisposition statement isn't named in the surviving press record. The photographs from that afternoon exist. Wallis and Edward are both interred within the royal burial enclosure at Frogmore, Windsor. Their graves within the same small grounds, visible from each other. The burial arrangements were made in 1972, following Edward's death. Lady Colin Campbell's 2012 biography, which mainstream royal historians don't regard as reliable, claims that the Queen Mother quietly arranged for Wallis's burial not to be placed directly adjacent to Edward's. The royal household has denied this account. Both the claim and the denial are part of the record. Neither resolves cleanly. What can be confirmed without dispute, the Queen Mother lived for 16 more years after Wallis's funeral. She didn't visit the Frogmore plot. She died at Royal Lodge on the 30th of March, 2002, at the age of 101. From Edward's abdication in December 1936 to the Queen Mother's own death in March 2002, 66 years. Shawcross's official account, 900 pages, complete archive access, sympathetic and thoroughly researched, explains those 66 years as rooted in the constitutional crisis, the permanent damage to the institution, the burden placed on a man who'd never wanted the throne, the fundamental impropriety of a twice-divorced American as potential British queen. These explanations are real, documented, and available in the correspondence. They also explain exactly what the official account requires them to explain, and nothing more. The founding myth of the reluctant royal, which Shawcross's biography presents whole, rests on a reading of Elizabeth's multiple refusals as evidence of her preference for private happiness over public duty. It's the reading that appeared in every press account of the engagement in January 1923 and hasn't been seriously challenged in any authorized accounts since. The Times' contemporaneous description of Albert as a plain Englishman devoted to duty, and Elizabeth as a young woman who valued her freedom, was the template the public biography took for the next 80 years. What that template requires you not to ask is why a young woman who valued her freedom, served as a royal bridesmaid twice, maintained an active social presence in exactly the circles surrounding the palace, and declined a specific commitment on multiple occasions across a specific 2-year period before accepting it. The template requires those refusals to be about modesty and the weight of royal duty. The documented parallel timeline, Albert proposing repeatedly while the Prince of Wales remained privately devoted to a married woman across all those proposals, requires the template to be, at minimum, incomplete. The personal explanation beneath the institutional one is this video's argument, not established historical fact, that what Wallis Simpson finally and definitively secured in June 1937 wasn't merely a crown, but a man. The specific man whose name, in the tradition that can't be confirmed but also can't be dismissed, sat beside 3 initials in a dressing table drawer for 82 years. That reading is supported by the documented sequence more strongly than the official account has ever acknowledged, and less definitively than the most dramatic telling of the story would prefer. The Royal Archivist, in the version of the story, replaced the dance card in Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon's personal papers in 1979, where it remains. 3 initials in blue ink, written in the summer of 1920, beside the name of a man who, it turned out, wasn't above going after, only unavailable to be caught. Wallis, Duchess of Windsor, died on the 24th of April, 1986. The Queen Mother was photographed at Royal Lodge that afternoon, 2 miles away, in good health. She lived 16 more years. She didn't visit the plot. If you'd like more stories like this one, subscribing means you won't miss the next one.